Welcome everybody to another episode of Axioms on Trial. I'm going to be alone on this one, so hopefully things pan out well. Hopefully Dr. Markos is kind to me, and I don't get destroyed by the philosophical mind that I've been trying to see what your position is and get to a position of where maybe we can have common ground. But I still think maybe in this conversation it'd be good to ask questions, things of that nature, to make sure we don't talk past each other. And I think you're all too familiar with that kind of stuff. That said, I'm going to pass it on to you. If you want to give the audience a little description on your background, your maybe what you are, denomination, what's your favorite sport, whatever.
Great. Well, my name is Lou Markos. I'm a professor of English and scholar in residence at Houston Baptist University. So I'm calling from Houston, Texas. And this is my 30th year teaching, Mike, which proves I started teaching when I was 17, obviously. I'm actually a Yankee. I've become a true Texan, but I grew up in New Jersey. I went to undergraduate school at Colgate, which is in upstate New York. I did English and history. And then the master's and PhD were at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And my specialties there were the Romantic and Victorian poets. But I've always wanted to be a generalist. So I do anything that has to do with ancient Greece or Rome. All four of my grandparents were born in Greece and emigrated to America. So again, I've got that Mediterranean love of life and joy of life. And I hate any philosophy that uses A's, B's, X's, and Y's. So we're not dealing with that. And I'm an English professor, not a philosophy person, sort of like C.S. Lewis, English, but a little bit of philosophy in the background. But I'm really into life. Now, I have an interesting story because I grew up and came to know Jesus in the Greek Orthodox Church because I'm Greek. But during my college years, God sort of moved me into the evangelical world. So I'm at a Southern Baptist church, but I would say I'm more what C.S. Lewis called a mere Christian. To me, the important thing is what it says in the Nicene Creed, the Trinity, the incarnation, the atonement, the resurrection. These are the important things. And I mean, we can talk about it, but I'm not into debating how you do the Lord's Supper or how you do baptism. I want to get down to the core issues and just who is Jesus? If he was just a prophet, we don't need him. There's plenty of prophets out there. But if he was more than that, and also I teach at HBU, and we have a program here in cultural apologetics, Mike. And what that means is we're not only interested, obviously, in science and logic. I'm very much interested in intelligent design and write about that and all. But we also want a wider apologetics that appeals not just to logic and reason, but appeals to imagination and emotion, even to myth, to our yearnings and dreams. So I want something that's full orbed. And again, my big person is C.S. Lewis. And when I write about apologetics, it's usually his apologetics, which is not only mere Christianity and problem of pain and miracles, but it comes up in his Chronicles of Narnia and things like that. And so my first love is in engaging in life and talking about, because if all God does is exist, what's the big deal? The big question is he real? Is he truly loving? Did he actually enter into human history, or is he a watchmaker God that starts things and lets it go? I mean, what I'm really about is a dynamic God who's involved in our lives and who's reaching out and who only spoke directly to the Jews, but didn't ignore all the Gentiles and the rest of humanity, but spoke to them through what's called general revelation. Maybe we can talk about that. That's a little bit of where I'm coming from.
Awesome. And I want to make sure I get this right. When you say like appeals to imagination, appeals to emotion, things like that, you're saying that you do value those types of things?
I do. I think they're very, very important. And I don't know if we'll talk about this later, but I actually think, along with C.S. Lewis, that some of the arguments used against, Jesus, Christianity, the gospel, that it's just a myth, I actually consider that to be one of the strengths of it. It's more real because it doesn't just appeal to the mind, it appeals to the little pagan in all of us, right? Okay. And like I said, that's the big thing to me, that yes, God only spoke directly in the Bible and Jesus, but he also speaks more generally. All truth is God's truth.
Okay. And I'll point out, with that said, I'm not a mythicist, so maybe that'll kind of give you a little background on where I'm coming from. I describe myself in the sense of a methodological naturalist, a physicalist, lover of philosophy, not very great at it, but trying my best to understand a lot of the jargon and nomenclature and things of that nature. I guess my question would be, to start it off, if we talk about like appeals to imagination or things like that, one of my biggest things that I try to break down is that we do have a pretty immense imagination. We can think of pretty much anything we want. I can come up with pretty much any conclusion to what maybe a solution might be to a problem, or what I even want to eat. Right? We have this idea of trying to map onto reality with our ideas. Do you prefer any specific like methodology, or maybe any abnormal methodologies in which you can bridge the gap of imagination to reality?
That's what it is. I like to, for instance, to start with, arguments for God. Maybe we'll talk a little bit later about the fact that we all have a conscience, that we have an innate understanding of morality and ethics. And I would just argue that if all there is survival of the fittest, we wouldn't have this common understanding of morality and ethics. So that I think that there's a common human experience that we should live a certain way, but we don't, and we can't. And so where is the answer? And to me, religion, generally speaking, is man reaching up to God, trying to build a ladder. We try to do good works. We try to do this and that. And heck, if I'm a Hindu, I may actually have 10 lives to do that, but I'm still trying to climb up the ladder and get there, whether it's the 5 pillars of Islam or the 8-fold noble path of Buddhism or the 10 commandments or even the Sermon on the Mount, that we attempt to get up there because we know that we need to. And it's like, I think we all know that we can't do it, and yet we keep trying. Mm-hmm. And then I would argue that what Christianity is, and not any specific denomination, just Christianity is God reaching down to man and saying, here's the way to come to me. So it's a religion that has invaded history and appeals. It's like a myth in the sense that it answers our deepest questions. Who am I? Why am I here? What is my purpose? How can I be right before God? How can the brokenness be fixed? But it's more than a myth, because it actually happened in real space, in real time, under Pontius Pilate. So that's often the approach I take. We can take approaches.
Yeah, and so I think that's fair. I mean, you're in a sense that you're looking for the thing that kind of has the amalgamation of all those things into an answer. My thing is that when we go back to this imagination thing, is that I wonder how, if I could just postulate like any other type of answer for it, whether it might be, Islam, or maybe it's Gnostic atheist, right? Like there is nothing, or some form of Zoroastrianism or natural pantheism, or whatever it might be. If those all, solve that problem, and I think this kind of is going towards like the underdetermination problem that some people bring towards scientific realism. I think it is a valuable thing to say, like, how do we know, do we have the sufficient evidence, or are we going off a select few evidence to come to that conclusion? What makes that maybe you call it a cumulative case, or the amalgamation of evidence? What is it that separates specifically from the Christian worldview having those answers, as opposed to me imagining something that could also potentially solve those problems in a panacea type of way?
Right. I mean, I would start with theism. In other words, an argument for what you would believe if you're a Jew, a Christian, a Muslim, a deist. Old style Unitarianism. New style Unitarianism is more New Agey, but the original Unitarians, the older style. Gotcha. So I would say first we need to argue for that, why we believe that there's one God, because the big distinction is, right, that in something like Hinduism or Buddhism, a lot of people think that's polytheism, but it's really pantheism. Everything is God, right? God is in everything and through everything, and all of the world is animated with God. And I find that beautiful and appealing. But if that's the case, then we don't have a standard for morality and ethics, right? That if we're going to have a standard for what is right and wrong, we do need a single God that is outside of space and time and that created the world. Because if God is the world, then there is no standard. I always think it's funny that one of the strongest arguments against God is, how can there be a God when there's so much injustice in the world? But I would suggest that the only way we could know that the world is unjust is if we have an understanding of justice to measure it against. But where do we get that sense of justice with a capital J? We can't get it from the Greek or Roman gods. We can't get it from the Hindu gods or Buddhism. It's got to be a standard that is above us. So now, a lot of people would say, well, all of our morality and ethics, that's just natural instinct, right? We all have an instinct to survive, to procreate, that sort of stuff. And I would agree with that, right? We do have those natural instincts. We're part of the animal kingdom. But my question is, what happens when two natural instincts come into conflict? So I've got to choose between self-preservation and preserving my family or tribe. How do I make a decision? And what we do, whether we realize it or not, is we have to appeal to a third thing, something that's higher, something that's not an instinct. There is something, just like if I'm trying to figure out what the next note is to play on the piano, I can't appeal to the piano keys. I have to look at the score, right? That is above and outside the instrument. And I would argue that, again, we couldn't have had the Nuremberg trials. How are we going to put the Nazis on trial unless we believe that there's a standard that transcends them? And we need to understand it's more than that. The only reason
you say it's fair that the standard there would be some form of utilitarianism, some form of the better for all the good. I mean, that would be kind of the appeal there. I'm a moral realist, by the way. So I do believe that there is a necessary foundation for me to claim morality on, but I don't see it as a sentient, agent or a being. That to me seems to be like more of a inherently subjective mind, especially if we get into like the Euthyphro dilemma and things of that nature.
Right.
So I guess I don't disagree with the appeal to something, but it's more so how is it? It seems almost like a top-down perspective of deciding it was this thing as opposed to like a bottom-up thing. But maybe you could elaborate on that.
No, that's good, and you understand that we're all, everybody thinks the modern world began with the Renaissance, but the modern world began with the Enlightenment. And what the Enlightenment did, it's often called the Enlightenment Project, is we have to refound everything from science to everything's got to be refound, as you just said, as a bottom-up kind of thing, rather than a top-down. Because again, what's unique in the Bible is not just in the beginning God created the heavens. It's just in the beginning God, right? There's two reigning paradigms. In the beginning is God, spirit, or in the beginning is matter. In the beginning is stuff. And all the mythologies of the world says in the beginning is stuff. And in that sense, Darwinism is a mythology too, because it says in the beginning there's just matter, steady state, whatever you want to call it. Of course, Aristotle was weird. He said that the universe was eternal and so was God. He tried to kind of have it both ways, but usually you're going to choose between the two. And we made that shift. But see, I would argue like a good way of expressing the different paradigm would be Freud in Moses and Monotheism, where he says basically we took our earthly father and we projected it upward and we created God the Father. And I would acknowledge the possibility of that, but I would say it makes a lot more sense that you have God the Father and human fatherhood is a falling away or a reflection of that. That is why, kids that grow up with a terrible father oftentimes still have a sense that their father is bad. Where would they get that sense? In other words, I would argue that we have a sense of what fatherhood should be, and that's what we measure things against, so that it's above, it's written in our conscience. See, that's what's weird about the Nuremberg trials, or anything like that. It's beyond just utilitarianism. The only way we can put these people on trial is that we're saying, whether we realize it or not, we're saying that what they did is wrong, right? So there is a standard. More than, and I'll explain why I mean more than utilitarianism, that what they did is wrong, that they somehow know that what they did is wrong, and yet they did it anyway. Because if we believe that they didn't know it was wrong, we would put them in an asylum rather than putting them in a prison or on death row. In other words, we understand that we are moral, ethical agents, and it's more than just utilitarianism. If a pit bull kills a child, we either let it go or we put it to sleep, but we don't put it on trial because it's not a moral, ethical creature. It's not a choosing creature. See, when it comes to nature, nature's all about what the laws of nature. Drop something, it's got to fall. The rock doesn't make a decision whether to give way to gravity or not. But when it comes to human beings, when it comes to our morality, it's all about ought, right? And who was that? Was it David Hume? You can't get an ought out of an is, right? And
Well, I actually take a different perspective on that. I'm actually in the minority. I don't really agree with the is-ought distinction. I mean, and it could be due to some of my lack of understanding, but I think that our lives are a constant interplay of these value judgments and value or factual judgments. So from my perspective, it's more that I think that philosophers have kind of divided questions of value and questions of fact into different categories, and that they're fundamentally different and incompatible, hence the is-ought, right? But the problem is that I think that these value judgments include judgments of facts. Like you're in every aspect of having a value judgment, you are smuggling in some kind of judgment of fact, and so and then typically that jumps to this idea of who can benefit. But from my perspective, it's almost like saying that they're incompatible as opposed to saying you couldn't use certain polyester threads and cotton in a shirt. And to me, that's where that it almost seems. It's like
about the Jewish law you're talking about.
Oh yeah, no, but specifically just specifically like it's the idea of that these two fabrics can't go together is kind of how my perspective is that I think that they absolutely can, because they're not separate categories. They value judgments are actually include judgments of facts in order for that value judgment. I mean, what would you say about that?
It's interesting because the same enlightenment that gave us the bottom up paradigm also gave us the facts value split. So it's interesting how you're relating to the Enlightenment, Kant and all the rest of them. And again, I think you're right, because what happens is we often get stranded, right, with the facts value split. Either, this is a thinker named Francis Schaeffer. I don't know if you've ever heard of Francis Schaeffer, but he talks about how we have moved into a two-level reality, and the way he explains it. And I think it's still true. Even I think you're trying to break this down, and let's see if it really does break it down.
Sure.
But what happens is that if we live in the bottom floor, the bottom story, the first story, we're living in the world of fact. We're living in the world of science. We can make statements that are true. We can make propositions, all of those things. But the problem is that in the lower story, we are deterministic. We don't really have free will. We're merely part of nature. There's nothing outside of nature. There's no part of us that transcends nature. If we don't have a soul, there's no part of us that transcends nature. And so we've got reason, so to speak, but we're trapped. And if we want to get that free will, that if we want to break out of determinism and have a sort of individuality beyond that, we go into the upper story. And in the upper story, that's where religion is, but that's also where the arts are. And that's where philosophy is, and theology, and all of those sorts of things. And we go in there and we find a world of value. But by doing so, we've given up the ability to make any sort of propositional statement like God is true or God invaded human history. And so we get stuck between the two. And do you find a way to bridge that we can have a bottom-up world that is completely Darwinian, or at least completely scientific, and yet still preserve a sense of free will and human dignity and essential worth and value that is beyond the physical world?
Well, if you're asking me from like a deterministic perspective, and I'm sorry, I had my mic muted because I unfortunately was unprofessional to not turn my cell phone off. If you can hear that in the background, and it's still, so if someone's watching this and they're calling me, please hang up. But I really want to turn that off if you guys don't mind real fast. It's going to keep ringing. Oh, nope, it stopped. Nope, it didn't.
Oh, there it goes.
1 second. All right, let's solve that problem real quick. And I'm sorry. So you said
if you stand up, we might see that you're wearing shorts like I am.
Yeah, or I might knock over my entire.
Yeah, sometimes I do these Zoom things with my suit and tie on, but I'm wearing shorts. It's kind of fun. Everybody wears pants anymore. It's great.
Yeah.
Oh, so should I step back to where did we cut off?
Yeah. Please kind of reference that again for me. That was my fault.
Okay, so you got the part about the two stories?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Okay, and then what I was saying was that maybe you've got a suggestion for how can we live in a sort of purely Darwinian world, a world just of science, of bottom-up reality, and still retain something like free will, something like true aesthetics, like a true goodness, truth, and beauty that is not just personal taste and nothing more. Where do we get a sense of the essential and inerrant value and worth of all people if we don't have, whatever, a creator God in whose image we were created
Sure.
in terms of values?
Well, so from like a deterministic standpoint, that is, it's definitely a challenge. My perspective on that is that I'm not like in any aspect of saying like I hope determinism to be true. In fact, I actually am very conflicted with the idea. I would much rather the idea of libertarian free will to be true. I don't see that be the case, but I would say, given the status of if you could, be a compatibilist or something like that, I think you could do it in that realm. From a deterministic standpoint, it's the fact that I have the illusion or the idea that I can make these judgments is basically what I have to kind of go off of, right? If it is the case that it is deterministic in that realm, I guess right there it's dead in the water, in the sense of that these things are just kind of happening in that sense. But I am not necessarily, I call myself a determinist. I've called myself a compatibilist, but I have to. The way I operate is off of this idea that there is this like illusion of free will, and so these value judgments and things I don't think aren't relevant to discuss in that aspect, because I'm not under like the Cartesian certainty principle of that determinism is true, and so I kind of would operate more under this idea that I do have some level of the will, right? And so for me, if I'm going to justify these things, at least on a scientific level, I'm not an empiricist, right? So I accept like a priori knowledge and those kind of concepts that we can, deduce arguments, and I'm okay with that. So for me, it's more about just if it has a testable prediction. Can it create a future testable prediction? If so, then that is reasonable for me to believe. But I'm never going to make the determination that these judgments of facts or judgments of value are absolute in any way. Does that answer what you're saying?
It's interesting. It's interesting that I think one of the things that really attracted me to the Christian worldview is it answered a deep, paradoxical question about man. And that is, how is it that the same human species can create a Hitler and a Mother Teresa? Of course, the paradox is much worse than that, and much more difficult, I should say, than that, because every one of us has a little Hitler and a little Mother Teresa inside of us. We all have that. And to me, the only answer, we're getting down to the very core now of worldview answers, is what the Bible says, that we were created good in God's image, but we're fallen and in rebellion and disobedient and broken. I don't see anything else that and I see it in the modern world. We've gone to one extreme or the other. Either we've gone to the extreme of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who says man is good and there is no fall, and it's just society that corrupts us. The whole idea of the noble savage. But on the other side, you have, the dark, and it gets down to, life is only survival of the fittest, and there is no altruism, there is no real love. We're just, cogs in a machine. And I just don't see anything that fully answers to our ability and potential for goodness and even self-sacrifice. And it's beyond the Darwinian stories, because if I sacrifice myself for someone and I'm a single man with no children, then where is the the survival of the fittest? Where's the progeny? Like I said, I can see some of those stories that they give about where my altruism might allow my seed to continue or whatever. But it doesn't. I just don't see that as answering everything. What is that impulse in us to good, and that impulse in us to evil at the same time? A
Sure.
complete selfishness, and what accounts for that?
Yeah, and I take more of the realm on, like, as a physicalist. I take more of, and a naturalist, that is kind of is the development. That is, you do see these things like altruism and other species and things like that. And yeah, it is different. I would say I understand the distinction within humans and how we have the ability to articulate, come up with these concepts like logic and language to try to. But I think that is a lot of the issue in some aspects, is that we have this ability to create language and try to kind of describe these things and map onto reality. But it goes back to that kind of, there's a bridge in between what we're using as descriptive logic or just ways to describe reality, as opposed to what reality specifically is. So as a moral realist, for me, I take more or less like maybe a Sam Harris approach on well-being, or I somewhat like T. Jump's moral philosophy on like imposition of will. I do think it suffers some problems when you start doing some like reductios and things, like we take it to its extreme, I do see some problems there. But for me, I think that is rooted within our survival. Like if we don't have that kind of innate ability, there is no there is no survival. And I think, I don't know if it's Kant that said it, talks about the what if we steal, then we have a world of just everybody essentially stealing. And
that's a categorical imperative.
Yeah, the categorical imperatives. And so my thing is that, for me as a moral realist, you only need one, and people might disagree with me on this, but you only need one moral fact to be true for moral realism to be true, or moral cognitivism to be true in that sense, right? And so the statement like killing babies is objectively wrong. I agree with that. And it's as simple as that in our fitness, or in our desire to survive from a cognitive or a neurological perspective, that if we just go around and we just kill babies, we don't survive as a species. There is no conversation about the well-being. There is no conversation about morality at that juncture. So from my perspective, it's more that these are rooted within sciences. Now, do we have the answer? No. The problem of philosophy, or the moral problems in philosophy is probably the biggest one, especially since I was a moral subjectivist not that long ago. And so I'm constantly kind of flip-flopping and fluid with it, but I'm trying to take a perspective of, what does the evidence suggest? Like, what, if there's this hypothesis, like, is it underdetermined or is it determined well? And I'm at the point now where I don't think it's underdetermined. I think that in everything we look at in psychology, neurology, biology, these things add up, that this is how our brain's wired. And when we see examples of this in people who are evil, there's generally something wrong with them. And so the example I try to use is that I'm not talking about the guy who denies physics and thinks he can fly, because he's going to find out very quickly that he cannot fly. And that is an objective fact. And so if there's something like wrong with that person's biology or neurology, then at that juncture, it's like, I would say that that's not what we're referencing, because we're not referencing this standard of how the mind has evolved and how the brain is supposed to operate. We actually can see, in schizophrenia, for example, we can see abnormalities within like the D1 and D2 receptors within like the dopamine model, right? And so we get these kind of things where we can see a normal functioning brain versus one that's not, or somebody causing harm because they had a tumor pressed against some lobe on their brain that controls anger and things like that, right? And so we see that these things are abnormal, and that's not the way the brain functions. And it appears to be that the brain is functioning in a specific way that is driven by natural selection, which is not like a random force by any means. So that would be, I guess, my perspective. Does that answer it at all?
Yeah, I think it's important, though, that the fact that we recognize the psychopath and the sociopath so quickly shows that we recognize that this is the exception that proves the rule, basically.
Okay.
Part of the problem, I think, comes down to, again, especially today when we're talking about morality and stuff, a lot of times people claim they're doing induction when they're really doing deduction in disguise. And this is what I mean, right? In induction, you start with all those facts and figures, and you work your way up to a hypothesis, or you work your way up to an inference. It's often called in logic, right? But in deduction, you have, what is called a syllogism, right? You start that a priori. You start with something you don't really prove, and you work your way down, right? So the famous one is all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, right? But the trouble is that people very rarely speak in a syllogism, right? They don't say it that way.
Yeah, sure.
They speak in what Aristotle called an enthymeme. And an enthymeme is Socrates is a man, therefore he's mortal. And what happens is we leave the unstated major premise unstated. And sometimes we do that because it's so obvious that you would think I was condescending to you if I said that. It's so obvious. But I think a lot of times we leave it uncovered because we don't really want to look at it. Okay, well, why is this important? Because I'll hear people say something like, let's say apartheid violates the innate dignity of human beings, therefore it's wrong and should be stopped. But you can't get directly from one to the other. You can only get there via the unstated major premise that human beings have innate and essential value and worth. But in a Darwinian world, that's nonsense. Nobody has innate we only have that innate value if we are created beings created. I mean, there might be other religious options, but you don't see them. I mean, in Hinduism, you don't have innate value. You don't have that in Buddhism.
Well, I would
You
say
have
you do in a sense. I mean, 'cause from my position, I think that like a Christian inherently has those values of well-being that are rooted in neurology because of just the example of they don't. I mean, typically you don't want to burn in hell forever, and you would want to go to heaven. And to me, that's a maximization of well-being or the minimization of it. And so, and I think that almost comes first in some of those aspects. So I kind of look at it as almost it's disguised in that ability, because there are those values. I mean, we have that value to in altruism or any type of thing. There's that value to protect you know, the young, or a bee having the ability to potentially risk its life for the sake of the hive, right? And so I do think that the value is there. But what would you say about that?
Yeah, see, oftentimes we ask the question, you know, can man be moral without God? And I think we often misunderstand what we mean by that, because if I say man cannot be moral without God, I'm not saying that atheists can't be moral, right? I'm saying that we would not be moral, ethical beings capable of goodness or even of evil if there wasn't a God, right? If there wasn't a divine standard of goodness, a transcendent God. Otherwise, there would be no standard, and we wouldn't have that written in our conscience. That's what I mean. In other words, obviously, you can be good. What Dante called the righteous pagans. Before we have that ability because it's written. Or even St. Paul said that Romans chapter 2 that the Gentiles who are without the law are a law unto themselves, because basically it's written on their conscience. It's there. We're moral, ethical beings, and again, that's what makes us different. But I should say before I forget,
yeah,
because I hear a lot about, you know, there's a lot of talk, and I like reading those books about brain injuries and what they do to us and things like that.
Steven Pinker's How the Mind Works is a great book.
Yeah, and then there's the more fun ones too. Who's the one that wrote Awakenings? I can't remember.
I actually think I have that book right here.
Yeah, you probably know what I'm talking about. The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. I've read a lot of his books. They're fun, but we need to understand, and this is important to bring up, because a lot of Christians seem to think that Christians are Platonists. In other words, we believe that we're a soul trapped in a body, but that is not, you know, the biblical Christian position. I am not a soul trapped in a body. I am an enfleshed soul. In other words, I'm not half physical and half spiritual. I'm fully physical and fully spiritual. For Christianity, Jesus is not half man and half God. He's fully man and fully God, fully divine, fully human. We're not fully divine and fully human, but we're fully physical and fully spiritual. So we are incarnational beings. So of course, if we have a brain injury, it is going to affect us, because, and again, like, you know, a lot of people, you know, Mike, I teach film too, and one of my favorite movies is It's a Wonderful Life. I watch it all the time. I love that movie. But it gave people the wrong impression that when we die, we become angels. And a lot of Christians think that, right? But that's never been the teaching, right? That angels are a different creation than us, right? Speaking just generally, angels are purely spiritual. The beasts, the animals, are purely physical, but we're the great amphibians of the universe, fully spiritual and fully physical. And the full Christian teaching is that in heaven, we will have resurrection bodies like Jesus does. In other words, we will, for a brief period, will be unclothed, if you will. But who we are ontologically is an enfleshed soul. So it's right that a brokenness in our brain is actually going to affect our mind or our soul. Mm-hmm. And it just bothers me, because so many people seem to think that if they can find some weird brain injury, that disproves all of Christianity. But it doesn't. It proves that we are beings where we're, you know, and I guess a good way to put it is, if I break both my legs and I can no longer walk and I'm in a wheelchair, but in my soul, so to speak, I can still walk, right? I can feel that I'm being caged in by my body, but I can walk. And if you've had any relatives that have Alzheimer's and have suffered with that, a lot of times when you're talking to grandma, grandpa, and they've got Alzheimer's and they've all forgotten, then all of a sudden they just say something out of the blue, and you realize the person is still there. The person is just being held in by a mental injury, the same way that the long distance runner who's now in a wheelchair is being prevented from his natural walking by a brokenness in the body, which will someday be healed.
Well, what would you say in regards to? So I got kind of two questions on there. I hope one, hopefully I'll remember. One, I kind of wanted to get into God and morality, but real quick, I was like, what would you think about like a split brain patient? Where we can get these kind of different answers, or even the entire, does this, from your perspective, would like the soul being removed, or is it an alteration of it? Because for me, I don't see how you reconcile within like split brain patients what's going on with the soul, or how it's a part of that, or if you even think it's part of like that brain activity or just an essence of the person. And so are you familiar with kind of those split brain patients and the kind of the answers they'll give to certain questions and how?
I think I've been reading about that. Yeah. Again, there's something deeper within us. Like I said, that little thing that suddenly shows itself in the Alzheimer's patient that seems to have forgotten everything, that the person is still there, but in a way they're covered by so many layers and layers and layers. And, we can do that to ourselves, right? We may be, quote, normal in terms of not being a sociopath, having a sense of consciousness and conscience and all that. But if I keep choosing the wrong path over and over again, I will sooner or later, the Bible uses the phrase, sear your conscience. I will dull it so much that I won't feel it anymore. So we can do that to ourselves. But again, I mean, we live in a broken world where there's this terrible brokenness, and sometimes people are born that way. But I would say that, again, that there is something deeper. In fact, there's been a lot of philosophers, Christian philosophers and others, that suggest we're not bipartite, body, soul, but we're tripartite, body, soul, and spirit. There's a great Chinese philosopher named Watchman Nee who talks about that, but others have spoken of it. The idea being that there's our body, there's our soul that is a mixture of the mental, the emotional, and the volitional, the will. And then there's the spirit, what God breathed into us, the deeper spirit that communes directly with God's spirit. And I think maybe that gets even deeper to the, and because in Christianity we're made in the image of a triune God. There's something appealing about that. That's not the normal view, but it's certainly out there, and I think that helps us to understand a depth to us that's there. I mean, that you can see it in a child that's born profoundly retarded or profoundly Down syndrome, and yet you the parents, particularly who know the child so well, see something deeper in there that can't quite come out, but it's there, I would argue.
Okay. And so before I forget with the God and morality thing, from my what I see in that is, like, if we took Romans, I think it's Romans 2:15. I'm going off the top of my head. I think Romans 2:15 is that is written, that essentially, like, it is written on our hearts.
Right. That's what I'm saying. Right. That's that.
Yeah. And so. And I don't want to get it wrong. I don't want to butcher it, but vaguely it speaks about that. If I was to like presume maybe that same standard was put in by something else, Satan or Allah or whatever other God, right? At which point doesn't it seem like you would come out smelling like roses, judged upon that standard that is written on to your heart, right? So like if Satan writ a different code onto my heart, then that would appear to be the objective standard based on the mind of that being, which would be inherently subjective. Like, how do you find problems in that? And then if you do, how do you reconcile them? Or if you don't, why not?
Well, this is why, again, I would ultimately reject dualism, Zoroastrianism, where there's a good God and an evil God wrestling for our soul. Because if they're equally good and evil, then how can you say which one is the good God and which one is the evil God? Because we've lost the standard. And Christianity sounds dualist because it's got devils and angels, but there's God and then there's good. And that's why Augustine and others, that ultimately evil is spoiled goodness, right? Evil is the fancy word is privation or negation, right? In a sense, it's nothing because it's a brokenness and a perversion and a twisting away of goodness. Mm-hmm. Because, even the most evil person has, life and breath, has good things, has good things, but those good things have been twisted into bad use. So there still has to be a standard beyond that, right? But
Yeah.
I
But
guess the question is, how does that God reach us and speak to us?
well,
Right?
so the more so the question is like, how do like if the standard is written, so it's written on our hearts by God, but if it was written by any other God, we would think that is the moral standard, right? And so my thing is, wouldn't that inherently be subjective? Because it's coming from the mind of that God to us, right? And I guess that kind of gets into like the Euthyphro dilemma. But before that, it's like, are we, is it good because he is putting that into us, right? Or how are we reconciling the fact that that would be essentially coming from his mind?
Well, that's the idea. Does God do a thing because it's just, or is it just because God does it? That age-old question. And I mean, like I said, even Christians debate about that. But I would say it's sort of like Augustine took Plato's forms and put them in the mind of God. So God, justice and love and beauty are part of God. God is a being in whom all those things are. And again, that's why even C.S. Lewis said he didn't like the idea. He even felt that if you go to a sort of hyper Calvinism where a thing is just because God does it, Lewis says you can end up with a demonic God. So in some ways, he actually voiced a little bit of what you're saying there.
Yeah. That
how do we know that there's that standard? And again, I think it comes down to, all right, and this is why again, God speaks. But if Jesus was just a prophet and a good man, there are very few people, even atheists out there, that don't believe that Jesus was a good man. There's a few people that think he's bad, but most people would agree he's at least a good teacher, a good rabbi, a good prophet, whatever. But if that's all he is, then we don't need him, because there's plenty of people out there who've told us how to live, from Confucius to Buddha to Socrates to Muhammad. We got plenty of people who give us the law and tell us how to live. But the problem is that knowing that, we still can't follow it. In other words, we need a more radical solution. And just yet another good person telling us how to live is not enough. The Stoics are great. Stoicism is great. And I've written in a few of my books that if it could be proved that Jesus didn't raise from the dead, then it's all a hoax, and I would be a Stoic. I mean, I think that's the most manly answer. If God has never spoken, then just, behave.
Is that Corinthians 1:15, right?
Drink, let us eat, drink, and be merry, right?
It's like if Christ didn't die, if Christ didn't die,
right. Then we're the most miserable of all people, right? Mm-hmm. Because otherwise, then he's just a teacher, and actually is a false teacher. Yeah. If he's that kind of teacher. So how can God bridge that gap, right? And I think a helpful way to look at this is, again, when we kind of look at religion, there are some religions like Judaism and Islam and Deism that focus on the transcendence of God. Here's God and here's the world, and they're absolutely separate. And if you ask a Jew or a Muslim or deist, is Jesus the Son of God? They will say, God has no son. Okay? Yeah. He's absolutely transcendent. They might even kill you. Right? But there are other people, Hinduism, Buddhism, Eastern religion, generally speaking, that says that God is the world. They believe in absolute immanence. God is the world. And so if you ask them, is Jesus the Son of God? They're liable to say, yes, Jesus is the Son of God. But so is Buddha, so is Muhammad, so are you, if you realize it. And Christianity is, of course, more transcendence, more like Islam and Judaism. God is transcendent, but the belief is that God actually entered into the world and became a man. I think Lewis said that if I'm Shakespeare and I want to talk to my characters and really interact with them, then I need to write myself into the play. Mm. And I mean, this is radical. Like I said, I mean, it's why Christians need fellowship, right? Because when you're all alone, you start to say, wait a minute, God became a man. Isn't that a fairy tale? And like I said, in a sense, it is. It does appeal to that. And I like what Lewis said. If it's right that Jesus should sound so much like a lot of the pagan myths, because if it didn't, it would seem like Jesus was a foreign invasion by a God who has nothing to do with the world. Maybe the Jews recognize him, but what are they, 1%, 0.5% of the world? And everybody else. But what happened is that the pagans recognized that, oh my gosh, what we've yearned for, what we've desired for, God coming to earth, returning and all that stuff. Maybe it really happened, and maybe this is the answer that we're looking for. And that's what I mean when I say that to me, the imaginative side, the myth, because what is a myth? I would call a myth. Okay, if I have a dream, it's a dream. But if an entire civilization dreams together, it's a myth. The myths embody. That's why I love, Joseph Campbell and James Fraser and, Star Wars and stuff, these archetypal things that are deeply written into us. But why is it that they pop up all over different cultures and different times?
Yeah, so Jordan Peterson takes kind of a position on that, like the archetypal narrative. I've never been really sold on that because it's more of like, I mean, I get it. It's profoundly moving, and I get that, but like, I don't see how it serves as the basis for an actual fact. But back to like kind of the morality thing with God is like, if I want to know like where, and not to fully press you, but one of the really hard problems that I find is that I see that there's this assertion God is the necessary foundation for morality, but in my studies, of reading the Bible. And I do a lot of scriptural analysis, that I don't see any actual moral code that's there that we abide by. In fact, what I see is that we're not really running away. We're kind of sprinting the opposite way of what these standards are, especially in regards to, the Old Testament. But if we even just take it back to the New, there's still some issues there. There's not really a reconciliation of homosexuality, of slavery, and these kind of things that we have changed, right? So, and I'm kind of curious on how your perspective of that is, because we don't see in the scripture what you should do in those kind of, what you said earlier, those kind of clash, like one good for a greater good kind of thing. We don't see like an example of how you actually would apply that to morality. It almost seems like it's just saying God is the standard. And then all the things that we've realized are immoral within the religion, we've kind of just done away with. And it seems like eventually it's going to be indistinguishable from the original context and content of the book. How do you reconcile like the fact that it seems almost as if as a humanity, we're not really applying that sense of morality at all? It seems like we're actually going away from it. I mean, we're not burning witches anymore, and we're not.
Yeah, I think part of the problem, and I see today with the whole LGBT and stuff like that, is there's this attempt to eradicate guilt. Okay, and ever since Freud, and increasingly since Freud, we have this idea that guilt is the problem. I would say that guilt is not the problem. Guilt is the signal that there is a problem. Okay, there was a great missionary doctor named Paul Brand who worked in India, and he discovered the cause of most leprosy. And the reason he figured it out is like, we see lepers that are missing a finger, but I never saw any fingers on the ground. What he discovered is that leprosy destroys your central nervous system so you don't feel pain. And most people would think that that's the best thing in the world. I don't feel pain. But if you don't feel pain, you will actually start falling apart. And something will get in your eye, and if you don't feel it, it will stay there. It'll fester. You might go blind. So pain is a signal that there's something wrong with our body, and we need to fix it. And if we don't fix it, we're going to fall apart. Now, we live in a fallen world. And so if you get cancer, let's say, then your pain signal has been broken. And so you're going to need to take painkillers to help you. But the point is that the pain sensor itself is something that's protecting you from something that will destroy your body. Okay, guilt is a signal that you're doing something that is destructive of your soul. And now, again, we live in a broken world. So if you were molested as a child and you have PTSD and you have an unhealthy kind of guilt, it's going to need to be treated with, talk therapy or maybe drugs as well. But again, the guilt signal can break down. But you can see it. I mean, the people that are shouting so much for different lifestyles and things like that, it's like, why are they so upset about it? It's like they're trying to deal with their own guilt. I mean, I'm just saying, this is not something I get off, but
sure.
But thinking about it. Okay.
Yeah, I would actually disagree, though, in the sense of that I don't think it's a guilt. I think it's more of that they're like these kinds of people are excluded from, this thing, and that, that their nature essentially is.
I do think we could have said that's true a while ago, but a place like the Netherlands, where it's all accepted, you're still finding amongst those communities the highest rate of suicide, the highest rate of drug addiction, of depression and things like that. In other words, even in a place where it's accepted, we still, and again, like I said, there's a broken, and I want to make it very clear too that I'm not one of these Christians who says, speaking of homosexuality, for instance, that there can't be any biological basis to it. See, a lot of people think that if we could see some kind of biological basis, that would prove it's okay. But of course, just because something is natural doesn't mean it's good. I mean, that's a phony stance to say that, right? A man who cheats on his wife is not doing it because it's unnatural. He's doing it because it's natural, right? But that still doesn't make it correct or healthy for the body and for the body politic. And again, I feel so sad that it's like we go from one extreme to another in our world. From one moment we're demonizing to the other moment we're saying everything's fine, everything goes, it doesn't make a difference. So like for one moment we went to demonizing the single mother in a terrible way, but now we've gone to the point of view of so heroizing it that a lot of men are just leaving because they feel like they're not even necessary. And a lot of women are like, oh, it's okay to be a single mom. I'll just leave my husband or my boyfriend. But what I'm saying is it's so, why do we go from one extreme to another, Mike? What is there in us that we
I
either...
would just say it's a shared need to have the same rights as the other people that are, demonizing you in that aspect. At least, it's really just a shared aspect of wanting equal rights. And we don't have to really get into the equal rights thing on that. If you wouldn't mind, I want to kind of shift focus a little bit because I know we're hitting the hour mark. I don't know how much time you exactly have. And there was one thing I wanted to hit in regards to some stuff in the Bible, not like a biblical debate by any means, but there's things that I find within the Bible I'm not going to be able to say that it's inerrant. Do you take the position that it's of some errancy, or how do you? Before I would ask my question, I want to make sure I don't straw man you.
I think the best way to define inerrancy, this is not my own definition, is the Bible is true in what it affirms. And what I mean by that is sometimes people use inerrancy to mean everything in the Bible must be taken absolutely literally. But to say the Bible is true in what it affirms is when it's being historical, it needs to be taken historically. When it's being poetic, it needs to be taken poetically. Now, there can be a debate within that, Mike, because I do think one person can argue that Genesis 1 reads literally. I think another could say it reads poetically. Right? So I think you can have an argument that both people that believe that the Bible is the Word of God. And remember, too, that the Bible, everybody that Jesus healed in Jerusalem eventually died, right? So a miracle invades the world, and a miracle doesn't break the laws of nature. A miracle suspends the laws of nature. It comes in there, but once the miracle's done, nature takes over. I mean, God did create laws. So in other words, the virgin birth, God miraculously put the seed in Mary, but once Mary conceived, everything else was normal. 9 months, normal pregnancy, all that sort of stuff. She would have had pain, and now I forgot what I was saying. Oh yeah,
no, you're good. Actually, if I could real fast.
Let me quickly say about what I mean by the Bible. So the Bible is inspired, right? God is speaking, God is moving through it. But once the Bible, that divine book, is in the world, it does fall prey to scribal errors. And that's why it's great that almost any Bible you have is going to show you discrepancies, right?
Sure.
But none of those discrepancies actually change any theological, any kind of actual theological truth. They're just minor things. But that should happen because once the Bible is inspired, nature is there. And that's why the churches had to work so hard to keep it pure and have scribes and check things. And the Jews before the Christians were incredibly careful about scribal things, but there can be errors there. That's kind of what it means when Christians say it's the most inspired in the original. They're admitting that there can be errors that sneak in, but I don't see any that change the faith.
Okay. Yeah. And the one that I want to bring up here in a second is not a contradiction. It's more of a editorial fatigue or docile reproduction, how we kind of know mark and priority, things like that. But you said one thing I really want to touch on real fast is that kind of like God suspends the laws of nature. I view it more as the laws of nature is an unguided force. And so when you have God coming in, that's now a guided force. It seems like there's kind of a category error there.
Well, that's why I'm fine with 6 days literals, long days, intelligent design, but I have very little patience with theistic evolution, because how can God direct an undirected process? So I'm not saying God can't use, well, first of all, I mean, God created all the animals after their kind, and every animal was given an adaptation strategy. And that really is what so-called microevolution is adaptation strategy. But I mean, even humans, we have found that there's a wall between the species.
Natural selection is guided. Or do you not take that position?
That you're saying that Darwin would say natural selection is guided?
Yeah, natural selection is guided. Like, it chooses against specific traits.
Well, yes, but it doesn't know where it's going. In other words, afterwards, something that keeps the species alive is going to be chosen, but it doesn't know where it's going. Right?
Sure, but wouldn't something that's guided not know the outcome? I mean, if it's guided, you could guide anything. I could guide my car and not know where I'm going, but if I'm guiding it, it's not a random interaction of things, right?
So, but what are you saying is guiding it? That just nature itself personified? What are you saying is guiding natural selection?
Well, it's guided by by fitness, by the survivability of species. I mean, what's going on with natural selection is not only just choosing traits, it's choosing against specific traits, and that's a huge thing to distinguish, where it's guided in some aspect. It doesn't need a guider. It's just things can be guided. When I mean the laws of nature, I'm presenting an aspect of these appear to be a descriptive way that we describe forces of nature that presumably those, gravity, things like that, are presumably unguided. But when you're suspending the laws of nature in favor of those for a God that's now governing it, I was more so seeing, if you think that these laws, I would assume you think that they're prescriptive and that they're guided by a God. I take the position that they're actually descriptive. And so when we have this introduction of it being suspended, I feel like you would need some form of basis for you to be able to say, well, here's why that these laws of nature are absolutely.
Well, what's interesting, and maybe you've read, there's been a lot of scholarship.
Theistic evolution wasn't guided. That's why I was I actually think you use that in favor of arguments for you. That's why I was kind of thrown off by it. But
you probably read some of these books by Stanley Yaki and what was the other guy's name? Oh my gosh! Anyway,
I haven't read anything.
Yeah. Why is it that modern science sprang up in the West and not in places like China or India? The Chinese technologically had invented things long before us, but they didn't invent science. Science is a Western creation. Why? Because they didn't invite science in the East, because their nature is Maya, nature's illusion. They're not going to find any laws. But all of the early modern scientists were either Christian or strong theists. They believed that God was ordered and balanced and harmonious, and that the universe was harmonious. And they believed that if they looked for laws, they would find them. But they wouldn't do that unless they believed that the laws were there, put there by a designer, and that we can trust our senses. And it's just ironic that we have the so-called faith versus science, because there would be no science in the Western world if they weren't coming out of a biblical worldview. Don't you think it's weird? You've probably heard people comment on one of the criteria that a law is correct is if it has elegance. The more simple and beautiful it is, like E equals MC squared, it's more likely to be true. And that seems to me odd in a world that's not created or fashioned or designed.
Well, no, I would say the law is more of just what we're describing about those relational behaviors. Like theories and of that such would be more of the idea based upon the purported evidence or the facts that would surround it.
So are you saying that the law is not there in nature? We're just making up. In other words,
so all laws of logic.
I guess I would say that Newton didn't invent the laws of gravitation. He discovered them. And he would certainly say that himself.
Well, no, he just described relational behaviors within reality. So it's descriptive. And I think that is a huge important thing that you touch upon, because it's kind of this prescriptive versus descriptive. Right. I view these things as descriptive. For example, programming major. So learning logic and design, it was one of my first classes. it was very apparent to me that these systems of logic are descriptive, because if we take the reality of a computer with ones and zeros, when we're creating Python and we're using C++ or Java or whatever it might be, when we're using these high-level programming languages, it is almost descriptive in what the computer capabilities are, what we can do, right? So we're just describing a function of the reality of the ones and zeros in a different way. And so that would be no different from where I stand, is that to represent that, that machine language or computer is reality, and we're taking the language, logic, mathematics, language, all those types of things, and describing how the world works. So if we take identity, for example, if there is no mind in the universe, the fact of identity remains because of how relational behaviors in reality just behave. Someone could say that it's guided or it's prescriptive because it does that. But the law of identity isn't a thing until someone's there to describe the fact of what you're saying is discovering this. But I see in no sense that this is a prescriptive, like, specific thing. It's just these are the relational behaviors within reality, and we're breaking them down into these laws so we can describe and model how reality works.
But Mike, as a programmer, don't you look at the DNA and recognize something that has been programmed and front-loaded with information? I don't think that's a construct. It actually is like a computer. It really is.
You saw about referring DNA?
Yeah, DNA. And when you look at it, it's CATG, but it still sort of works like a binary.
Yeah, but we're using that as a descriptive language to describe those things. So it's not really like a code. It's like we have developed this code to decipher like variations of TCGA, right?
That's odd. So but that's how the DNA works. I mean, I see it. You're saying we're using, maybe we can use the analogy of a computer to understand it, but it actually is something that is programmed and front-loaded with information. Because it used to be the old-style materialist said all there is in the world is matter and energy. But the more we study it, there's matter and energy, and there's information. And where else does information come except from intelligence, from design? It's just not random. The DNA is not random. The way it replicates, and it's an incredible system that it keeps getting more complex the more deeper we go into it.
Well, yeah, I mean, I see what you're saying. I just think like all information is physical. Like every bit of information is physical. So I don't see how that really presents a problem in the fact that because I don't see the intelligence aspect being an indicator for that. That almost seems like maybe I'm not using this right, but almost like a composition fallacy or composition division fallacy, where you're assuming like the whole based on its parts.
I see what you mean, but there's a difference between, okay, like if we have a book, okay, and you've got the words on the page, right, and we can explain the physical nature of those words, the ink that they're made out of and stuff, but behind the physical words themselves is the meaning that's behind them, and that meaning is information that comes from an intelligence, from a designer. In other words, maybe we could figure out, I don't think we are, but maybe we could figure out a way that the DNA strand itself, the physical material that it's made out of, how that could have maybe evolved purely by natural physical material processes. But the information behind it is something different than it's like having a little alphabet game and making words with it. Well, you can describe the physical composition of those little letters, but behind that, and even separate from it, is an actual meaning, is a blueprint, is a programming behind the physical facts. A difference that's kind of like brain and mind, I guess, or mind and matter.
I guess, but my thing is those, like when you have these, I mean, especially if you talk about like mutations and things, and we use CTGA, right? Like you can show this an example of like you just have cat, right? And then you have a mutation of C, so cat, sat, right? Now you have a completely different thing. You can change the, it's not that, to me, I don't see the correlation between this complexity and intelligence, because these mutations that can happen, that can formulate new information, right? Like in CTGA and mutations, we can see that it will create, and you can use that example, like, cats, you should have cat, right? And then you can change that cat, sat in a mutation from the C, from the second one to sat, cat, sat. And then you could change that to tag, right? Cat
Right.
sat tag. And you have three completely different words from the same kind of strand, and there was no intelligence that was involved really in that.
Well, it's interesting. I don't know if you're familiar with a guy named William Dembski, but he makes a distinction between complexity and specified complexity, right? So you find complexity in a what do you call it? It's not coming to me, in a gemstone or something like that.
Sure.
Okay, this is what he means by the difference between complexity and specified complexity. If you're going through South Dakota and you're looking at the mountains, and you look at a mountain, and as you look at it, you can see something that sort of looks like an eye or a nose or a mouth, right? Minerals and crystals, that's the word I want. There are certain complexities that come about from erosion, natural erosion on the beach and things, right? But if you turn the corner and you see four heads on there that clearly match up with four presidents, now you're looking at something that's not just complex, but specified complexity. It matches up with the reality outside of it. If I'm on the beach and the waves on the beach have created wavy lines and stuff, there's a complexity to it, but I recognize right away that it's just complexity. But if it's a language, even if it's hieroglyphics, I don't know that language. But as a human being, I can look at it and say, wait a minute, this is not just the natural weathering erosion of the waves against the sand. This is there's a specified complexity. This is clearly a language, even if I don't understand the language. I mean, this is how a lot of sciences work, right? I mean, if I'm an archaeologist, I can tell the difference between a random circle of stones that have been deposited by erosion. And when I see Stonehenge, I'm like, no, this is specified complexity. This is not just happening randomly. There is intelligence. I may not know, and people are still debating exactly what Stonehenge is, but it's clearly man-made, by which I mean there's an intelligence behind it. I mean, heck, what's his name? Carl Sagan knew that. He started that SETI, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, scouring the universe for signs of intelligence. And if he only sees complexity, that doesn't mean prove intelligence. But if he saw whatever, a supernova beating out the prime numbers, right? Suddenly that matches up with another reality and that specified complexity. And I recognize that the only thing that produces specified complexity is intelligence. Does that make sense, that distinction?
No, I see the distinction you're making. I'm more so I'm just not understanding how like this complexity gives way to some sort of intelligence inherently. That part I'm kind of lost on it, because like that could be the case. I'm okay with that being the case. But we see things within nature, and if we have a sample size of one, right, our own universe and things like that, it's like I'm not sure how we can actually have a real intelligent basis to make that claim of saying like, well, we look at other universes so we only have this sample size of one, and we don't have an example of the intelligence that inhibits it. Like, I'm okay with the necessary foundation of things. That's perfectly fine with me. I just don't see how it is an intelligent thing that has to create this form of complexity when it starts at a level of, almost increasing complexity as time goes on.
But what's interesting is, especially of course, nobody really follows Darwinism anymore, because Darwinism says nature makes no leaps. And now we've got Darwinian mutations. So we're not even really doing Darwinism, but the modern neo-Darwinian fusion may explain how those how those mutations can make changes. But the Darwinian system doesn't work until you have the DNA. In other words, what cannot evolve by way of the neo-Darwinian fusion is the DNA itself, because nothing happens until you have a DNA that can replicate itself, and in replicating itself can make copying errors. So, I mean, you probably knew this, that Watson and Crick, I think it was Crick, wrote a book called Life Itself, where he recognized that the DNA was so complex, it could not simply have evolved. It's front-loaded with energy. And he was the first one to suggest panspermia, that it was...
Well, I would be interested in how he determined it could not be, because from where I'm standing, that seems like just a personal incredulity fallacy, that it could not, it has to be X because it could not be Y. It doesn't seem like a really good argument for that. It seems just pure incredulity.
Well, kind of what he did was a version of that, where he said there is clearly intelligence here, front-loaded information, and God is off the table, so we'll have aliens or something like that. In other words, he's still, I think maybe it was aliens, but that just pushes the question back.
Yeah. Okay. So you're saying he more so was open to that level of intelligence, regardless of what it'd be. And I understand that, but it's like you're almost like limiting your category in that sense. It's like I'm really big on falsification and stuff like that, but a lot of this stuff seems like the falsification criterion is just so like tiny that I don't even know how you would begin to falsify the hypothesis if you were starting with it couldn't be anything else, because you've pretty much already determined it couldn't be anything else, and then falsification is not even valuable to you at that point from that standpoint.
I mean, like I said, scientifically speaking, we know how to recognize design and intelligence everywhere else. Anthropology and here and there, sociology, we know how to recognize it. But then when it's there in front of us, again, Darwin could never, he thought of the cell as kind of like a little blob. He could have never conceived of and the complexity goes all the way down. And it's not just the complexity of the DNA, but the more we understand it, we more understand that there's sort of a blueprint that tells it what to do and how to assemble. And you're probably familiar with the concept of irreducible complexity.
Yeah, I have a feeling we get into that.
Yeah, I mean, and he's written. I haven't read his newest book yet. He writes well. He's kind of funny ways to put it. But again, I don't see, and anybody even trying to. They're still trying to show how mutations can create. I mean, mutations usually weaken the animal and usually make it sterile, if nothing else. And it's not working. That species threshold is just. It's not being broken. We certainly can't break it with all of our intelligence.
Yeah, well, and I would say, like, for me, it's like I really think, it's important to say, like, I find all this stuff absolutely fascinating, beautiful. And more so when I've been getting into my studies, like I'm absolutely fascinated with this stuff. I think it's like the most beautiful kind of thing that you could do is learn about these concepts and understand it. And so I'm always open to those potential explanations, but circling back to like kind of the beginning of the conversation, I just find it's an underdetermined hypothesis that by via reductio or just positing any other type of explanation that I'd get off the same ground. And so what would you think? What would you think about my perspective of reserving judgment and saying, well, I'm a methodological naturalist, but as far as I can see, everything is natural. I don't have any way of determining that it's not, but I'm open to that. I guess I would find that maybe the more rational position to take than kind of deciding it would be something else before we actually knew it was something else.
I mean, I guess, and you're familiar because the title was Darwin's Black Box, that Darwin offered his falsifiability, right? He said, if there's any system that can be found that could not be arrived at by a series of slow incremental stages, then my whole thesis would fall apart. Yeah. And I guess what would constitute proof for you of design? I mean, I can't think of anything more design than the DNA on such a microscopic level with all of that. And I should mention too, there's a really neat book called The Privileged Planet that shows that not only is our universe, incredibly designed. Are you familiar with that whole idea of the what's it called? What's the word? Fine tuning. Not only is our universe fine tuned for life, we are also in one of the rare places in the universe that allows us to study the universe, right? So some of Einstein's theories were not fully proven until an eclipse, right? Because we couldn't do it. And if it wasn't for the location of our moon and all that stuff, we wouldn't have eclipses and we couldn't do things. It just, to me, it's wonderful because it suggests an intelligence that actually wants us to analyze and study the world in which we live, which is kind of neat.
Well, doesn't the like if you invoke kind of the fine tuning, like if we found a more habitable planet, does that crush that for you? Because the sample size we have for the universe is one, right? So I guess all we could really use is maybe another planet with life on it, because it seems that people use these measurements when they do the fine tuning that are a little bigger. Like there's someone did a really good, I think it's Arvin Ash. He's got a YouTube channel. It does a lot of like physics and stuff. He kind of relates it to a lot of the arguments with the fine tuning will be like 10, if we were 10 to the 333, whatever, away from the sun or whatever, we would, we'd die. But the actual increment that we'd be using in comparison to like a basketball player would be to say, well, if LeBron James was, 10 to the whatever versus 10 to the whatever, he couldn't play basketball in any aspect. But that's because one is a 100-foot LeBron James, and then the other, which is just one increment, is a like 6-inch tall LeBron James. Right. And it seems that these measurements do seem that this is the case. Like, okay, well, if it was off by one, but what is the value we're really using? Because it does seem that there is actually that leeway within the universe, and it does seem that we have discovered habitable zones better than our own. So does that undermine the fine tuning, or how would that work?
I mean, like
if that was the case.
Yeah. I mean, and like you said, if we found life on another planet, that's, not in and of itself to say that, God couldn't have created other creatures that he didn't tell us about. I mean, he certainly created angels, and we don't know that much about them. So it's just that, again, it's like I said, it's funny because the first people that started this were the number crunchers, the probability people. And they're like, when you really run the probability of just a few of these things, that number exceeds the number of atoms in the universe. I mean, it's such a humongous number. It's like, throwing a dart and hitting one atom in the entire universe or something like that. But again, it's not just complexity. It's a complexity with meaning. It's a complexity that allows human life to exist. And that's what's neat, because I used to, there were times where I'm like, oh, does the fact that the universe is vast, does that make us, small or unnecessary? Well, no. The medieval people knew that the universe was vast, not as vast as we know, but they knew it was vast. They knew that the earth was like a dot in space. They all knew that. You can read it in Boethius and Dante and stuff. But the medievals didn't fall into, I think, our own fallacy that size is a marker of value, right? A woman who's 5'2" is certainly not of less value than a woman who's 5'10", right? But we've bought into this strange notion. In fact, the more we study the universe, it seems like the universe has to be the huge shape and size it is for life to be possible on planet Earth, because the rest of the universe is creating the raw materials that make this possible. So what I'm saying is that the universe I can't prove this, but there's some evidence that the universe has to be as big and spread out as it is for there to be life right here. And it's just amazing that we've not found any other life. I mean,
yeah. Well, there's a really good poem. I can't remember. I think it's Douglas something, but he has a really good poem, and it's about a rain puddle that is in a hole. And it's a conscious rain puddle, and so it's basically the idea is that the puddle finds itself, and it starts postulating, wow, what a wonderful hole I find myself in. It fits me so perfectly, right? And so it seems that it comes from this perspective of that this hole was designed for me, not recognizing that it is actually the product of its circumstances. And as the sun rises and as it heats up, the puddle gets smaller and smaller, trying to hold on to the notion that this hole was made for it. But when we actually look at it, we do find that, in that analogy, that our puddle is shrinking. Doesn't seem that it's necessarily fit for us in that aspect when we look at, where we could even go off the planet, and some of the things that are on the planet, like eye-eating locusts and things that eat from the inside of your eyes outwards.
Right.
The mere fact that
that was something that bothered Darwin, some of those things.
Well, yeah, and just even vestigial organs and structures that we have and things of that nature. It's like I don't see how it fits that notion, because it doesn't actually appear that the puddle, in the analogy I'm using, it does seem that it is the circumstance of its environment, and that's why we have the issues that we do, especially in an evolutionary sense. What do you think?
Because the same thing I said about man is that this is a good world, but it's clearly broken. It's not the perfect world we would invent. You remember in the Matrix, they said at first they made everything perfect, and people kept waking up because they couldn't believe it. And we're not in a perfect matrix in that sense. We're in a C.S. Lewis said in Problem of Pain that this may not be the best of possible worlds, but it may be the only possible kind of world for God to do what he wanted. He wanted a world. Lewis calls it a free will experiment. He wants a world of human beings that make choices, and those choices have consequences. So even in the Garden of Eden, there was the possibility of pain, because if I fell down and hit my head on a rock, there's pain. right? It's not like the world changes because I want it to. The world, Lewis calls it a neutral playing field. You need a neutral playing field against which to enact this moral, ethical nature that we have. Again, the world too, there is a kind of, in other words, not only has man fallen, but nature's fallen. And interesting, the Bible suggests language has fallen too, with the story of the Tower of Babel, that we are in a broken world, right? And I'm not insisting on absolutely everything literal, but it is interesting that, if you have a literal flood, then maybe the only way to drain the water after the flood is by what we would call plate tectonics, to pull things apart and allow the ocean to form as it did. But that plate tectonics is also what gives us all of our earthquakes and all of our volcanoes, right? So it's kind of weird. And what I'm saying is, it's like I see evidence of fallenness in our world, in our nature, as I do in us. Like, it's wonderful. It's got this system that it's like the earth is alive and it's moving, but that continental drift that allows this world also brings earthquakes and volcanoes and all things like that. The whole system that allows the water to move from place to place also ends up creating tsunamis and hurricanes and things like that. So there's a mixture of good and bad, I guess, and we can recognize that mixture of good and bad.
Yeah, and I don't want to accuse you of doing this. I hate bringing this out and accusing people, but I feel like, you're in the philosophical mind. And so you understand when someone throws a fallacy out that it's not anything personal. It's just trying to attack the argument. But wouldn't it be a variation of a Texas sharpshooter fallacy to look at, say, the tectonic plates, as you mentioned, as a way to for the flood? Doesn't it seem more like a Texas sharpshooter, a post hoc kind of rationalization where are you familiar with the Texas sharpshooter fallacy? It's not really used as well as I feel like a lot of other fallacies, but it's essentially when you shoot out a barn, you walk up to the barn and you just draw the bullseye around it right after the fact.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, or you shoot an arrow at a tree and you walk up to the tree and you just put the bullseye around it. Or if you've ever played darts, no one's looking, you just go throw the bullseye. Right. Say, hey, would that be a fair analysis from my perspective?
I'm just throwing that idea out.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
Throwing that out is
just a random idea. Yeah, I don't want to attack you on a random thing. So
what's odd about the world is that there's a good and bad in it. These things, the seasons, all the stuff that happens also allows for destruction at the same time. Mm-hmm. We need this fecundity in nature. We need insects because other animals eat insects and other animals eat those animals. But then all of a sudden you've got a locust thing that destroys everything. I'm just saying that I guess what I'm saying is that it all seems mixed up. Just like in us, there's the Hitler and the Mother Teresa. In our world, again, because some people that get into environmentalism, it's almost like they're worshiping nature, like it's God. But nature is also messed up. G.K. Chesterton said, "Nature's not our mother; she's our older fallen sister, not our mother." Created by the same person, but yeah, I don't insist on that.
We're at the 125 minute mark. I don't know how much time you have. I have not eaten today, so I'm gonna.
I know, yeah, we gotta kind of wrap it up. But
my Braves are one game away from.
I guess maybe a good way to end it is that, because again we're talking about these issues. The thing about Christianity is, I don't think it's something that we would make up, and yet after God does it, we recognize something true about it. Like I said, if we were making up Christianity, it would be just yet another version of follow the rules and climb up the ladder. And so many Christians fall into that anyway, what we call works righteousness. I don't think we would invent this idea of the gospel, right? Of God dying on our behalf. That it's got that strange twist of truth, C.S. Lewis says. Mm-hmm. And again, see, it's interesting that you're familiar with the liar, lunatic Lord, right? Jesus made these claims. What did he mean? And it's very important to emphasize that argument does not. That's
C.S. Lewis.
That's C.S. Lewis, yeah. But it's important that argument doesn't rest on believing the Bible's inerrant, right? All that it rests on is that the Gospels are reliable. And somebody like Luke is one of the great historians of the ancient world. And what's interesting about the liar, lunatic Lord thing quickly is that that's not necessarily something that C.S. Lewis is making up. Jesus's enemies also did that, because none of his enemies said he didn't say that. His enemies said, well, he said that because he's a blasphemer. So
Well, would you say that there's another L that we're not possibly thinking about?
you're thinking of
Legend.
legend, but the thing about legend is it happens too fast. It takes a generation at least, and already, even a lot of the more liberal, quote liberal, I mean the theological liberal Bible people are saying, Romans is very early, and in Romans, Paul is already relating a very early tradition about the resurrection that many people think may go back to just a few years afterwards. In other words, there's not enough time for the legend. And what's really interesting about it being a legend is Jesus has to keep telling them, I'm not a ghost. They want to believe he's a ghost because this is so radically different. What else could have got these Jewish Christians to give up the Sabbath and move it to Sunday? Now, what would stop them from the sacrificing animals? I mean, their whole religion was based on this, and the resurrection is something that happened that changed everything. And that's why I think the best apologetics focuses on the resurrection and how a judge would read it and things like that. But again, it's one of those things that if Jesus is just another prophet, then we don't need him. In fact, I don't want him because he expressed the moral code in the most difficult way possible. It's called the Sermon on the Mount. Right? So if he's only a prophet, we're in big trouble because we have a hard enough time with the 10 Commandments and the 5 pillars of Islam, right? Try to really follow the Sermon on the Mount. My gosh. So we don't need him. But if he's something more, then like I said, all I can say kind of in closing is one thing that I said to me, if God really loves us and cares about us, then how is he going to show it, right? All of us at one point think our parents don't understand us, even if we have good parents. Our relatives don't understand us. Well, there's no way that a parent can really understand his child. The only way I could fully understand my child is if I could change places with them, like those Freaky Friday movies, right? And be them for a day. Well, if Christianity is true, it means that God actually became a human being, became one of us, and suffered all of and Baptists, all we ever talk about is the pain of the crucifixion. Actually, that was the least bad of it. Jesus was betrayed. He was condemned. He was humiliated. He was spat upon. I mean, those things affect us much more, right? We were talking earlier before about name calling. That hurts us much more. If somebody punches me, the pain goes away, right? But to bear the humiliation and scorn, that is one of the things that really attracted me to Christianity, not just as a religion, but as, oh my gosh, is this revelation from God? If God really did this, then everything changes.
And I asked in the comments if anybody wanted to do a Q&A. Might not have time for that. I did that a little late. That's my bad. But I do want to thank you for coming on. I really enjoyed this conversation. I know I asked you a lot more questions and stuff. Typically I want people to come on. I want them to feel comfortable and ask questions. A little bit of fight, pushback. But
I want to say I'm really glad that the reason Mike got my name is because I did that thing with Tom Jump. And I just want to say that both of these, I don't call them debates. I call them dialogues. And
yes.
At any time, it's nice to have a peaceful dialogue. But right now, with everybody at each other's throats, I think this is a real model of the dialogue that we're losing in our country. Maybe we're losing it in the world. So thank you for as they say in Greek, an irenic or peaceful dialogue. So.
Yeah, I again, and I don't want to be come off like I'm blowing smoke up anyone's ass, but I legitimately valued this conversation. I can tell you're a great human being, and that you're a searcher for truth, and that we have that. If there's anything to have a common thread, that's I think the common thread between us is the love for philosophy and love for knowledge and wisdom and things like that. And I think that should be expressed. And if you are an atheist watching, these kinds of dialogues are fruitful. You can have. I refer it to as like the candy vegetables. Like people don't always want to eat their vegetables all the time, right? They don't want to have necessarily listen through maybe some conversation, because a lot of people want the candy. They want the yelling back and forth, or no, you're wrong, and here's this, that fallacy. And we we'll have debates like that on this channel. We're a roughly new channel. Dr. Markos is one of our first theist guests on here. Matt Slick was supposed to be on, but he got sick and something happened. So we hope he's getting better. But I really thank you, because you came on right away and we're just I would do it. No problem. Email me. And so again, I greatly appreciate that. And I love to have you back on. Maybe we could talk more about the Bible or something like that.
The unexamined life is not worth living. That's what my hero Socrates said. So
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Mike. We'll definitely do this again.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'm gonna close out, guys. There'll be a little countdown stream. Dr. Markos, feel free to go ahead and exit out of StreamYard if you feel. I'm gonna go get some food, and everybody.
Send me a link when it's done, and I'll shoot it to my Facebook group.
Yeah, awesome. And I oh yeah. If you haven't already, Axioms on Trial, please go subscribe. Really will help us out if people can subscribe to us. We just hit 100. We've have 8 or 9 episodes. I think that's pretty good. At least I like to tell myself that's pretty good. I was expecting to have 38 subscribers for a year. So that's pretty cool for me. To end the rambling, thank you guys. Much love. And stay kind to everybody.
Great.